Okay, so now for one of the most important instructions that we will learn in SQL, which is the create table command. So this create table, just like you are probably imagining, if I write here countries, I'm going to create a table named countries. And oops, I had here a typo. I also had a typo here in this country, so I'm going to drop this database and write it again. There you go, now it's named countries. Don't worry, because we'll learn how to drop things and delete things here in MySQL next. As I was saying, we have here countries, which is the database .countries. I'm creating a table countries inside the database countries. Just by coincidence, and because it makes sense for this example, they have the same name, but they may have different names, the database and the table. This is extremely similar how we called, for example, in a select all, how we call the Sakila.film. We go for the database Sakila and the table film, okay? Remember, if I go here, I'll have here the film table, which can be used to perform queries on, just like we have here countries.countries. What we are doing is creating this table. Now, to be a table, we know that we must give something to SQL or to MySQL, so that MySQL is able to populate that table. And first and foremost, we need to give the columns that this table will contain. Before inserting rows into the table, we need to give the structure of the table, which columns and information is this table going to contain. This is where our data type knowledge will come in handy. So I open here the parentheses, and then I can start to write the columns that I want to populate this table with. And for example, I'm going to use country ID. Now notice country ID will be the name of the column that I'm creating in this table. And now I have to give some properties to this column. Just like we've seen that there are certain primary keys, there are certain data types for specific columns, this is exactly the space to give those instructions to SQL. So here I want a country ID. It will be the identifier that will be used to identify each country in a unique way. Here it should make sense to be a number. It could be the country code, for example, as a text or as a varchar in this case. But here we are going to use an arbitrary number to represent multiple countries. And so what I'm going to do is call this an integer. But I know that I'm not going to have that many countries in this table. I'm going to have the maximum 10. So I can use a tiny int. This is something that's extremely common for us to do when we are building SQL tables. Understand what are the expected values that we are going to have in this integer column, and then using the scale that we know from the past lecture, from tiny int, small int, and so on. So I'm going to use tiny int, and now I want this to be the primary key. What is a primary key? Primary key is something that identifies the row in a unique way. That means that this primary key can't be duplicated. For example, if we have a table where the name of the person is an ID, we cannot have two John Does as an example, because as the name is a primary key, it must be unique for each row. So we can't have two repeated rows with the same name in that database when the column is defined as primary key. Primary key is what identifies a single value in the table. Here is the country ID, because each country will have one ID associated with it. Common primary keys, for example, an invoice number may be a primary key because most of the times it's a unique number for a single invoice. Tax ID, for example, is an ID for you as a citizen in your country. It's your own number and no one else has the same tax ID as you. So that's your unique primary key in your country, transposing these examples to real life. So here in the table it's exactly the same rationale. We need a column that is identifier of the table. Of course, it's not mandatory that a table has a primary key, but it is common when we are modeling data to have tables with primary keys, because they will be used as a relationship with all the other tables. So I'm also going to add here something, auto increment. This will create a new index. So if I have a country ID 1 on the table and I insert a new row, it will automatically create a row number 2 and with the ID 2. So I'll leave here this property auto increment. You'll see how this works in a minute. And I'm going to say primary key. Okay, I've defined everything that I wanted for this country ID. Now, I could also define here, for example, 3 or 2. I'm not going to define it. I'm going to leave it in this way for you not to get confused right now. Country ID is a tiny integer, meaning that will go until, and let's consult the documentation, it will go until the value 127, because it's also a sign column. I can make it an unsigned column. Let's also add that property to this primary key. So I'll add here, it can be after a tiny int, unsigned. Okay, cool. I'm going to put here a comma. Now I've defined my country ID that can only have values until 255. That means that as this is the primary key, I can only introduce 255 countries in this table, or at least 255 lines. So after this, I can have the name of the country. So this name will be a varchar, and now why is it a varchar? Well, because of course names of countries have letters and it's normally a text, free text. I don't think there is a country in the world that has only numbers, so it makes sense, of course, to be a varchar. And here, I think the longest number of characters for a country is around 40 something or 50 something. I'm going to give 60 just in case, so I think this is enough. This means that I can't go over 60 characters here on this column, remember that, and we'll check more examples next. And here, I don't want a country to not have a name. I think that in this table, it must be mandatory that the country has name. I can use a property called not null. What not null contains is that this column can be a null value. In that case, when I insert data into this table, I must have a country name. This property, not null, is also added after creating the field. Now notice, this is something really interesting because the concept and the syntax is mostly the same. You give the name of the variable, you give the data type, and then you give additional properties to the field that you want. We've learned a couple of them, for example, auto increment, primary key, and also not null. You can check more on the internet, more properties that you can use for the columns, but these are some of the most common ones that we can use when creating tables. Okay, I want a new column. Notice that what I've done is just comma new column, and I'm going to say foundation date for the date where the country was founded. And in this case, it makes sense to be what? A date, of course, as we've learned. So here, as we are dealing with dates, we should have this format, date, that's the data type of this column. And finally, I'll have population, and I'm going to do something here, put it as a small int just for you to check. Does it make sense to be unsigned? Of course it makes sense to be unsigned. There are no countries with negative population. So I'm going to put it unsigned. Cool. So here is my create table statement. So super simple, as you can see, this syntax is really straightforward. We use create table countries.countries. We start with the name of the columns, and then we put data type and the properties that this column will contain. So as you can see, this is pretty straightforward, and now I think it rings a bell. We spent a bit talking about data types in the past section because this was much easier to explain because we already know, or at least we are familiar with the data types when we do this command. So now you can focus on the create table command itself and not understanding what are the data types and why they are in this way. We spoke a bit about it before, and now the concepts should at least merge together. Okay, so I'm going to give here our final part of the query, which is of course the dot and comma, and I'm going to run this one. Let's see if this was successful, and there you go. We have create table countries.countries successful. If I do select all from countries.countries, I'll have, of course, an empty table, as you can see here, because I don't have rows. I've just created the table structure. And now let's see what the describe that we also learn will give us about this table. I'm also curious to see what we'll have here. And of course, it's exactly the structure that we've defined before. As you notice, we have here the columns that we've set as not null are here with no, and also the primary key, because the primary key can't be null by default. We have here the primary key indicating that the country ID is the primary key, auto increment with our extra properties that we use, and also our data types. So as you can see, this is exactly the same output that we've seen before in the data type section, and we've created our own output, so to say. So this is how we can create tables in MySQL. I hope this was explicit. Don't worry to drop me a message if you are having some trouble understanding this. Let's go to the next lecture where we are going to insert our own data, which will also be a pretty exciting part.